Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Matt Robeson, who is software product manager at Amber Road. And today we're going to talk about why duty drawback is making a comeback. Now, the spotlight is certainly on global trade management these days, with Brexit and tariffs, in the headlines today, which are forcing supply chain and logistics executives to figure out ways to successfully navigate through the risks and uncertainty that are out there in the marketplace today. And one area that's getting renewed attention is duty drawback. What is it? Why is it gaining more attention today? And what are some of the important factors for success in implementing and managing duty drawback? Well, those are the main questions we're going to address in today's episode. And it's great to have Matt on the program to share his insights and perspective on this topic. So, Matt, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Adrian. Glad to be here, and thanks for having me.
Great. Well, Matt, like I always like to do when I bring on a new guest on Talking Logistics, I'm always curious how they got involved with this industry to begin with. So before we kind of dive into duty drawback, why don't we start by learning a little bit about your career path? How and why did you get involved with this industry, and what are your current role and responsibilities there at Amber Road?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think a lot of us, go to school for supply chain or logistics, or definitely not trade compliance. I kind of stumbled into a role at a foreign trade zone consulting and managed services firm. So we actually consulted and actually managed remotely the operations of foreign trade zones nationwide. And that, kind of gave me a broad education on import, export, duty management. It's really kind of a holistic look at the cross-border movements and management of goods from a duty perspective as well. At Amber Road, I work in product management with responsibility for our duty deferral solutions, including FTZ and some EU customs warehouse solutions, duty drawback, as well as some other compliance solutions. My role is very dynamic. I connect the business needs with technology. And that means that we really need to keep close to customers as well as market needs, understand what our pain points are, where things are going, keep up with trends, and of course, keep up with policy and regulatory updates. Any given day, I might be working with customers directly to get requirements, to understand issues they're having, working with development to design and implement solutions, and then working with marketing, of course, to ensure that our messaging is really consistent and clear to the market. So it's really a very unique view of the industry, and I think we're gonna have a good discussion here on why duty drawback is really making a comeback.
No, that's great. And, kind of being in the front lines there and kind of getting it from all angles, if you will, being able to talk to customers and hearing what their pain points and issues are, keeping a pulse of what's happening on the regulatory front. At the end of the day, this is probably one of the most dynamic parts of global supply chain management, this whole area of regulations and so forth. And like I mentioned in my opening comments, things like Brexit and what's happening with tariffs, only adds to the risks and complexities, out there in the marketplace today.
Absolutely. I think every country has had a very interesting past few years in global trade and economics, and we're certainly going to see that probably not slow down anytime soon.
Well, it keeps you busy, it keeps me busy. So I guess at the end of the day, it's a good thing. So let's talk about duty drawback now. I mean, some people may not be familiar, with it. So why don't we start there? I mean, what is it, and what types of companies have traditionally implemented a duty drawback program?
Sure. So drawback is, to give a concise definition, the refund of duties and fees on goods that were previously imported into the United States. And after those goods are re-exported or destroyed, 99% of those duties and fees can be recovered in most cases. It's, for those folks new to it, it's kind of similar to an income tax refund. You could think of the imports as your income, and the exports or destroyed goods, those are similar to a tax credit, where you can sort of equal those out and get a refund based on that. Traditionally, we've seen big users come from the petroleum industries as well as manufacturing. Typically, companies that have a high volume of exported goods will be good candidates, and that's just a very rough characterization. Manufacturers, they'll almost always typically be importing a substantial component of their inputs, right? And after those finished goods can be exported, or potentially some of that is destroyed in the process, those components may then be eligible for refunds. Petroleum has been a huge user of drawback, traditionally the biggest single industry that uses drawback. And it's partly because they have had historically a little bit more flexible rules than the rest of the folks out there. They have been allowed, since I believe the 80s, to basically interchange product at the 8-digit HTS level. And what that means for them is they could actually import gasoline and they could export jet fuel and claim drawback on that imported gasoline when they fill up an airplane and that leaves the country. So that's, really created interesting opportunities in the petroleum industry for drawback, and there's really kind of a niche industry just around that particular type of drawback in particular. Typically, you'll see larger enterprises have bigger ROIs, simply because of the scale. The numbers here definitely matter, volume of imports and duties paid compared to sales abroad. And drawback can also be very complex depending on the type of drawback, the supplier relationships. So there is a bit of overhead that has to be accounted for. So you typically see, those companies that have a big ROI coming from the manufacturing and petroleum industry, and also larger companies are able to really support that overhead to actually, put a process in place and recover those duties.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wasn't, that familiar with the, petroleum industry being a big adopter of this. Certainly from the manufacturing standpoint, when I've worked with manufacturers, particularly those larger companies, I've seen that,
Right.
Obviously importing, a lot of the inputs, and then, a lot of those products getting exported out. I think your point about, generally speaking, historically, it's been kind of the larger, companies that have taken advantage of this, because there is some level of complexity and, from a people process, technology standpoint, you have to have in place to really, do this, successfully. I mean, so duty drawback is not necessarily new, but I think now some other companies are starting to look at it that probably in the past either looked at it and didn't think it was right for them, or maybe this is new to them. I mean, what is that? Why is that? Why is there now, renewed interest in taking a look at duty drawback?
Yeah, good question. Drawback is definitely not new. It's one of the first customs programs put in place actually back in 1789 with the first Tariff Act. And, of course, the first iteration was a bit simpler than the rules we have today, but it is underutilized massively. It's estimated that I think around 500 to 600 million is recovered annually, but that's likely only 15 to 20% of the total recoverable amount. So, companies are leaving 80% on the table there, which is kind of a staggering figure if you look at it from companies that are always looking at the bottom line, right? Really, there's a few key factors. I'm going to point to probably three today. First being the modernization of some of the policy around drawback, and that was really started with the 2015 Trade Facilitation Enforcement Act, which tried to streamline some of the legacy drawback rules to allow the rest of the industry to adopt some of the rules that the petroleum industry had actually been using for some time. So now the rest of the industry can use substitution at the 8-digit HTS level. And what that means is you may see distributors that are importing, for example, a T-shirt of one type, maybe let's say just a plain white under T-shirt, and they're exporting a different type of shirt that falls under that same 8-digit HTS. They now previously they had to look at a ruling that was out there where a company had previously applied to customs and made an application and said these two products can be considered to be interchangeable. So they really had to go and do their homework there. Now, if those two products have the same 8-digit HTS, they can essentially consider them commercially interchangeable for the purpose of drawback. And there are a couple of caveats that I'm not going to get into the weeds of here to do with the HTS description. That's one of the driving factors. The other one with that policy change is a timeline. Previously, you had different timelines based on the type of drawback. For manufacturing, you had one timeline. For unused merchandise, you had another timeline. And that really kind of made it difficult to figure out, what percentage of your imports and what percentage of your exports might be applicable. Now there is a timeline the clock starts ticking at the time of import, and up to 5 years after import, you can file a claim on those. So that really simplifies things and allows, I think, a more standard process to come into place. The other key portion, along with that policy modernization, there's also a component of putting that drawback process into the ACE system, the automated commercial environment that Customs runs. Previously, only part of the drawback filing process had been implemented as in that system. It was basically, you file and you create a drawback header, sort of, where you just had the entry number, and you had to actually mail Customs the supporting documentation, and they would have someone sit at a desk and go through your 500 PDF documents and try to come up with your claim. Now they have implemented, and this just went fully live just a couple months ago in 2019, a fully electronic claim filing process, which allows Customs to really accept and process more claims overall. And it also allows service providers to come into this environment and build software that aligns with those processes and allows companies to potentially file themselves, or at least to streamline the process internally. So that's the second point. The third is really the tariff, retaliatory tariff environment that we have right now. The big one is the 301 tariffs. A lot of companies were seeing 10% duty on goods coming in from China. And these may have been companies that previously, weren't paying duty at all. I mean, in most developed economies, there typically are not high import duties. Those are typically a trademark of a newer economy that doesn't have a lot of other sources of income. So a lot of companies that didn't have that ROI previously, they're now seeing on the imports from 2018 that they paid, a lot of duty, and sometimes they weren't paying any before. Now they're paying substantial amounts. So it maybe it's just simply be the numbers working out that's driving companies to look into drawback programs. There are, certainly other duty management programs like foreign trade zones, bonded warehouses that would allow you to defer those duties in case of export or destruction. But there was really simply not enough time for companies to put those types of programs into place, really to react at all, in terms of making changes to their supply chain or changes to their suppliers. So that's what we're seeing now. This is more of a reaction to what has happened, starting primarily in 2018 with those tariffs.
No, a lot of great factors there. I mean, I'm surprised that the how much money is being left on the table historically. With this, I mean, I think you made the analogy in your opening remarks about when you were defining duty drawback as making the analogy with people filing for tax refunds. Right. I think most people, from a personal standpoint, if you knew you had a refund coming, I think most people will file their taxes on time and look forward to getting that check in the mail. So that's one thing, and I think secondly to your, the other aspect of it is, the modernization, right? Making this more electronically, these transactions more electronically enabled, in terms of moving away from some of these paper-based processes that was part of it. So I can see that as being another historical, inhibiting factor, if you will. And it still surprises me, to this day, you would think that, we talk about digitization, we talk about, and we've seen the transformation that's taken place with the internet and the web and so forth. But the reality is that, in a lot of supply chain processes still, you've got this dependency on paper and paper-based documents for transactions. And it sounds like that was until just a couple of months ago, that was something that was still a part of this process as well. So, I can see how that, created some friction in adoption. But,
absolutely.
But with all these factors you talked about, certainly, I think the reality is that, the expectation is that more and more companies now are going to be at least looking into implementing duty drawback. And so the next logical question is, well, how do you get started? I mean, what's the first step? And I mean, what are some of the, the challenges or considerations involved here?
Yeah, I think we've already seen a lot of companies, that are looking at where do they take that first step. And I think the easiest would be to, first of all, if you paid a lot more duty in 2018 than you did previously. So if you are one of those, then it's probably an easier calculation. But even if you're not, this includes both groups. Really, what you want to start with is to do some rough estimations of what that return might potentially be. And what you can do is you can get an annual amount of duty that your company paid last year or the year before. You can consider back to 5 years. So, probably try to get as much data as you're able to if you don't have a drawback program at all. And then, so get that duty amount, which you may have to go to different departments to do. You may not even have it internally. You may have to go to a broker to get that. So it just kind of depends where you have that available. The finance departments, certainly should have that though. Then you take that number and consider the percentage of sales are exported. And again, this is just a rough estimation. So let's say 10% of your sales are exports. I could take that 10% number and then roughly estimate that 10% of the duty that I paid last year, I might be able to recover because I have a matching export against that. And you could take that same calculation, do it with goods that are destroyed or goods that are manufactured and then exported or destroyed. So if you do have an ROI at that point, if you're looking at a number that's in the 5 digits, hopefully higher than that, depending on the size of the company, that's of course a factor. Then look at if your company is the exporter of record, so that this is where it can get a little complex. If you're not the exporter, and the exporter is where the actual right to claim drawback is, then you still may be able to claim drawback, but you may need to get some documentation from the actual export of record to transfer that right over to your company. If you have that right, or you're able to get that right transferred, look at the import of the goods. If you're not the original importer of the goods, then you still may be able to claim drawback, but you then in that case may need to get some additional documentation from that supplier. So there's the initial calculation, do I have an ROI? Then there's, am I the exporter of goods, or can I get documentation from the exporter? And then, am I the importer of the goods? And if not, can I get documentation from the importer? And you're going to need proof of export for those goods, or proof of destruction. Proof of export typically could be a bill of lading. It may be a customs entry into another country. If you're going to Mexico or Canada, often customs will ask for the customs entry into that country. May get a little tricky there. But essentially, you need to ensure that you will be able to get documentation to support the original import as well as the export or destruction. So after building that business case, then I would really take it to the higher powers that be within your company. Ultimately, a drawback program is going to need a sign off from an officer of the company or someone high up enough, and that's really going to help you speed things along. There are some financial, of course, impacts. So CFO maybe get involved, but you definitely would want to start with that business case and then try to identify where within your existing processes you're able to get documentation, or if you need a new process to get that supporting documentation.
No, great advice there. I mean, I think sometimes getting that data, like you talked about, it could be challenging for a lot of companies, particularly if it's not within their four walls, right? If they have to rely on brokers and others. So I know with just a lot of different types of supply chain initiatives, just getting that data to understand, to kind of create that baseline or kind of create that business case, as you mentioned, might be a good first step. I mean, you would think that you would have the answer to the question, how much did we pay on duties last year for this product category, at the tip of your fingers, but that could be a difficult question to answer for a lot of companies, just because of where the data is and normalizing it and so forth. But I think that's a great starting point. Obviously, if the business case is there, you've put in all the foundational requirements in place to move forward with this. Technology is going to have to ultimately play a role in this whole process to help simplify and streamline the process. I mean, what is the role of technology, and what capabilities should companies look for in a solution?
It definitely comes into play at that point. The scenario you mentioned, if I as a company am not able to even identify or procure any of my import documentation, the obvious first step would be to, get some kind of system in place or get a process with a broker system, get some kind of visibility to your entry documentation. But the overall, the level of automation or solutioning you would need really is going to depend on the volume. You oftentimes these drawback programs, they kind of start within a business unit, and that one warehouse puts this process in place, and they've got all the documents there. They have that audit trail to support that product line going through that one warehouse, and they controllers look at, here's how much we're saving from this warehouse. Oh, we should roll this out to the rest of the company, right? Well, to scale that process up, to accommodate that volume, that's where certainly you would need to look at getting a way to systematically get all that documentation in the right place to be able to track all those imports and exports through a single system. And that may not be, or it may be something you have already today with your ERP or warehousing systems, or with a broker system, or some combination of that. You may also look at how you're going to file these claims now. The vast majority of companies in the past have used a service provider to do the filing, and that level of service may kind of vary from like a black box filing where I'm just passing through data and that company's sending it to customs. It may vary all the way to that service provider is going to be actually identifying and prepping the claims, supporting the audits. They may be outsourcing really that entire thing. So the capability is going to vary based on how much you want to take on internally. For manufacturers, it's definitely important to be able to track the bill of materials as well as all the components that go into that. So there's simply no way to do that without some sort of automation. And some methods of tracking unused merchandise may require you to also track every type of product of that same SKU or batch that came in through that warehouse, whether it was sourced domestically or foreign. So that would call out for another area where you need to be able to leverage a consistent tracking. You also need to consider that you'll need to be able to support audits as well as archive data for years after the filing. I believe it's 5 years after the liquidation of the filing, which typically is going to be between 6 and 7 years total. And certainly to the filing itself, there will be some system in place to actually connect with customs and provide the proper format and codes that need to go into that filing as well. So really, it kind of depends on how much the company is looking to take in internally. But I think to really scale up a process, it would be good to have a system that helps you to aggregate the import and export data, match those transactions together using whatever type of matching that you're using that's approved by customs, and then to be able to output that data, whether you're filing yourself or you're having a service provider do that, needs to be able to output that data into easily consumable formats that can be filed to customs, and then have that audit trail available to survive that audit. Customs is going to come in, and they'll probably want, with the ACE modernization, they do have the capability to process more data, but they also have a lot of automation on their side of things to enable them to really audit almost everything that comes in. So everything that comes in is definitely going to have a set of validations run against it, and will likely have some level of audit against it. And there's going to be an increase in the number of desk audits, which is where you have an officer looking over supporting documentation like invoices and entries. So you need to be able to support the claims that you are filing.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that, as you were kind of going through, all the requirements here, if you will. I mean, this truly is, when you think about this, this is just a component of the overall end-to-end global trade management, process, right? Because you've got the imports on the one end, the exports on the other end. You've got bills of lading and invoices and purchase orders. You've got all these types of documentation and data that ultimately has to get linked or tied together, as part of this, duty drawback process, as well as other, types of global trade management processes and customs filings and so forth. So I think, one of the things I'm seeing is this move toward, again, having this, to your point, having this a platform that is able to bring, that data together and make those links and connections, and then ultimately, integrate, whether with customs or service providers, to facilitate the transfer of that data or information or documents, obviously now in more electronic format, to streamline and automate, all of this.
Right.
Because I think, if you're, my takeaway, whether it's with this process or everything else, the days of managing these types of processes with Excel spreadsheets or with, a lot of, throwing a lot of bodies at it, it's just ultimately when you're trying to scale it, it's just not going to work out, doing it the old way, if you will. So Matt, we're running short on time here. So just as a way to kind of wrap up, what are some of the critical factors for success then in implementing and managing, duty drawback?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, there are companies, you can outsource this entire thing. What we've seen the most success from is going to be when a company has someone that internally is the champion, someone that's somewhat of an expert in drawback, is able to look at, supply chain, look at opportunities, look at where things are coming from and going to, and identify, where they may have some of these high value opportunities. But not only that knowledge needs to be spread, between finance, logistics, supply chain, trade compliance. Ultimately, you're going to have to work with all of these departments to get that import data, that export data, to make sure you have a receiving process in place where you're capturing and linking back to your imports. That's where you're going to really get the biggest ROI on a drawback program. And I think once those departments are knowledgeable and they see that there is a positive impact on the bottom line, they're also going to be, going out there and looking for additional opportunities for these types of savings. There are also certainly, collaboration that may be required with suppliers. So, having those folks that have the strong supplier relationships in the case that you need to get that import documentation or need to work with someone to get the export rights. Those are very important relationships as well. Ultimately though, it is going to be a collaborative effort. A good process certainly will help scale the program up. Like I said, you will have to support that audit process. And if you are scaling up this across the company and these programs across the company, you do need to have a consistent process so that, if customs is auditing a claim from one warehouse, it's not, substantially different from a claim from another warehouse. So there's a warehouse level operation to consider, but then also a company-wide operation to consider, especially when scaling up a program. Ultimately, it's going to be a positive impact on the bottom line. I certainly think every company is going to be eager for that these days. And it does, as you mentioned, encompass pretty much every aspect of global trade, import, export, supply chain, and logistics. It's really one of those unique programs.
Well, it sounds like, in supply chain management, we always talk about, the importance of, people, process, and technology. And it certainly sounds that that's the case here, or this is a great example of that. So obviously the technology is important, from a streamlining automation, standpoint, but having, the right people in place that have knowledge of this area and can identify some of these opportunities and see it through is critically important, as well as, communication and collaboration between not only internal functional groups, as you talked about, but also with, suppliers and customs and external parties as well that might be involved in this process. So Matt, very meaty topic here. I mean, we could probably spend, 2 hours talking about this and how to implement this successfully and so forth. But I think you provided some great, food for thought, some great advice on how to get started. So thank you again for making the time to be with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adrian, for having me.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Amber Road website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Matt, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.